G'day, my name's Luke Rowe. I'm a university lecturer and researcher who specialises in evidence-based teaching and the science of learning. And in today's episode, I'm going to share with you 10 big ideas that I got from attending the Improving Schools Summit last week in Australia, in Melbourne. And it was local to where I live, so I had the opportunity to attend, and I found it very, very interesting and intriguing. And I hope to share some of the insights and lessons I got from that with you today. So the first big idea is that practical strategies win over evidence-based strategies. So what do I mean by that? Well, I started the conference with sitting next to another person who's a school teacher, and she was wonderful, and she was trying to implement evidence in her practice at schools. And I asked her, where does she get her evidence from? And she was showing me all the different sources of evidence. And a lot of it was quite a lot of rigorous evidence, but it was always couched in very practical terms: acronyms, alliterations, posters, visuals, diagrams, flowcharts. These are the sorts of things that tended to win out in capturing teachers' attention, as opposed to more statistically rigorous research, research that tends to be more credible with the learning sciences community doesn't necessarily become the most used research in terms of what's implemented by teachers. So that was an interesting revelation to me. It confirms a lot of the expectations and prior knowledge I have in that area. So it was interesting to see that that's a really important implementation science strategy for those of you who want to take evidence and translate that or mobilize that into practice. If you're a learning researcher like me, you want to remember that you want to package your ideas in a very accessible, practical manner so that teachers can implement that. And they're time poor. Teachers are always working against the clock. So unless we do that for them, we're going to waste their time. So that's lesson number one. Now, the second lesson here is best practice becoming common practice. So right now we know that the research shows that a lot of the evidence doesn't make its way into the classroom. And certainly the best evidence doesn't always make its way into common practice amongst teachers, educators, and students. There's a lot of reasons why that is. It's a part of my research remit into looking into those reasons why, the enablers and barriers to implementing evidence in education. One of the things that Alina Douglas, the convener, said that I thought was beautifully spoken. She said that education is more symphony than solo. Education reform, even more so. And I think that reminded me of why we often fail to make best practice common practice, because we try and do it on our own. And if we are to help mobilize evidence and the best possible evidence into common practice with educators so that there's a huge uptake of evidence among educators, then we've got to get them on board. And we've got to do this in communities of practice. We can't let teachers do it alone. It can be a very isolating experience when you go out on a limb and try and implement evidence and you don't have anyone alongside you to talk you through some of the pain points and progression points in how to implement that evidence, the enablers and barriers. So I think that's a really important point around making best practice common practice. Now, the third big idea is when reforming an education system, remember, knowledge begets knowledge, and curriculum should reflect this. So the Right and Honourable Nick Gibb, who's a former UK Minister for School Standards from I think 2014 to 2023, so he's pretty recent on the job, he talked about all of the ideas around implementing evidence at scale, at a national scale. And he worked with the Educational Endowment Foundation in the UK to implement various literacy, reading and writing programs at a national level to try and take their rankings up, or to improve society and to improve the education of the England's youth, but also to improve their rankings in the international standards like PISA, Program for International Student Achievement, as well as TIMSS and a lot of those international benchmarks. And they actually achieved that. And I thought it was a remarkable case study because they have in the UK a very unique natural experiment going on where they've got 4 countries nested within their UK structure: England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And as a result, those countries have jurisdictional differences, and they had the ability to opt in and out of the national reforms around implementing evidence at scale across those countries, first in literacy, then in numeracy. And some of the results, and I'll try and put some of them on screen, were incredible. And to me, it was one of the most potent examples of how evidence can help reform and improve the education system at large. Because what it showed was the countries that opted out, the 3 other countries that opted out of that evidence reform, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, they all suffered in their progression in relation to other countries and the international standards and benchmarks around literacy and numeracy. So England leapfrogged the other countries, and as a result, they, I think, have very much affirmed the importance of evidence-based reforms in their education system. Now, Australia, where I live, has started to adopt some of these practices, but they're very recent. So we don't know if those results and those reform efforts have percolated into downstream improvements for student outcomes in international benchmarks. There has been some movement upward, and I think it's going to take a bit more time for those results to sort of filter down. One of the things, though, that he also said was that any reform effort that is worthwhile has to be bipartisan or non-partisan, because in a reform effort that is politically to one side, the left or the right, you're not going to get the other sort of group on board. And as a result, any reform effort will only last as long as the electoral or political cycle of power that reform effort has been couched in or contextualized within. So if you want a truly important and long-lasting reform effort that survives any 4 to 6 to 8 year cycle of government, and we often need reform efforts to go well beyond those government electoral cycles, then it's got to be non-partisan so that it can go the full span of time that a reform effort needs to have traction, to have downstream benefits, and for you to see the green shoots and then the fruits of those reforms. So if you're an educational reformer, if you're a politician or a knowledge broker in that space, it's always going to take a lot of time. You've got to get everyone on board, all the different factions and groups of people on board with it. Otherwise, you're not going to have this reform effort be sustained in the long run. And if you don't have a reform effort sustained into the long run, it's not going to work, because reform that's worthwhile takes a long time. Now, the 4th big idea is this: what is the why and the how behind evidence in evidence-based teaching? And I think Ross Fox, who is in charge of the Canberra schools in the Catholic education system, said it really well. He pointed out this idea that whenever we have an evidence-based policy or an evidence-based reform in education, we should be able to predict what will happen when we implement that reform to student achievement outcomes or student wellbeing outcomes or student attendance outcomes or whatever your desirable outcome is. So what he's really saying is that we don't really understand the evidence unless we can predict the cause and effect relationship between implementing that evidence and the temporal association, the causal consequence of that evidence on the lives of the learners. So I found that an incredible sort of rule of thumb to see if we really truly understand what we're doing in education around evidence-based teaching and the science of learning. What will happen to the students if I implement this strategy? I also think Jennifer Buckingham, who's the ED of Policy and Evidence, the Centre for Education Statistics and Evaluation for the Department of Education New South Wales, she's an incredible person, and you could tell from the way she spoke, she really knows what she's talking about. She said, just saying that it's evidence-based does not give a reform magic sparkles and fairy dust. And I thought that was a nice way to put it. Using the word evidence can become a non sequitur. It's something that we use a lot of in my space in academia, and it has a very particular meaning. It means peer-reviewed research that's been through had a methodology guided by the scientific method, which is a systematic application of different study designs to examine the causes, correlates, and consequences of various interventions or observational trends and relations between different variables. And it's about having a system where that can be repeated and with a high sense of reliability and confidence in the inferences that we get from that research. Outside of academia, the word evidence can go through different mutations and mean different things to different people. So I think that's where Jennifer Buckingham was suggesting that it's not like fairy dust. We can't just say the word evidence after everything we do in education and therefore justify it as evidence-based practice. There's a particular meaning to the rigor of evidence that we're looking for. So we can't just retrofit it on everything and then justify every practice as evidence-based practice. There was also a bit of disagreement on a panel, and they were talking about this idea of whether you should regulate evidence-based teaching practices amongst educators or whether you should educate educators to commit to these practices. And I think it was a bit of both, right? So the panel came out neutral on that, and they realized it wasn't it was a false dichotomy, right? So whether you should force teachers to adopt these practices, you might get a bit of rebound from that, a bit of what we call a boomerang effect. You have a response that's inverse to your intended outcome. It goes against the principles of self-determination theory by Richard Ryan and DC, who talked about this idea of autonomy and agency over our choices as one of the motivating factors. But on the other hand, if you have the laissez-faire approach where you only have teachers willy-nilly approaching the evidence, we know that there's likely to be very poor uptake of that. So you can educate and empower teachers to understand the evidence better and to understand the benefits and the cost-benefit trade-off of implementing evidence in education. And the hope is that the combination of light touch reforms as well as high levels of education for educators on the evidence will be a good combination. And at the nexus there is the sweet spot for any educational reform movement in that space to have traction over the long run. Now, the fifth big idea is that if we manage behavior, we manage learning. And I think that sometimes we think about behavior management as being a separate category compared to learning and improving learning amongst students. But the argument here was that they are inextricably linked. And I think it was McDonald who was speaking, and he was saying, Tim McDonald, I think his name is, and he's an expert on behavior management in schools. He's a very good speaker, is really dynamic, and I think he's one of the founders of DataWorks, which is a professional learning and development provider for educators in Australia. He talked about this idea that when teachers object to taking extra time to manage classroom behaviours in a proactive manner, and with the argument to say that it's going to take them too much time and they've got to get through all of the content, the argument that he made is that we're in fact giving time back to teachers by managing student behaviour proactively instead of reactively. So we give the teachers their time back, and we do this by implementing routines in schools and multi-tiered systems of support and scripts and templates and very strongly guided frameworks for behaviour management around proactive behaviour management instead of all of the reactive stuff that gets us caught into this vicious cycle where we're spending all the time looking after the students to manage their behaviours and the rest of the students aren't being attended to, so there's more behaviours manifesting there. And as a result, we're constantly being reactive, putting out proverbial fires in the classroom instead of spending all of our time with an ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cure. I thought that was a really interesting point there. The other point there that I thought was really interesting was that you've got to teach those behaviours explicitly and model them explicitly. And you do that in the same way that you teach any other content in schools. You tell students exactly what sorts of behaviours you want from them. You talk about what they look like. You help the students give you a sense of feedback and do checks for understanding for the students to give you the signal that they understand what those behaviours are. And you work on it with them and you reinforce it with them. You revisit those principles and practices with them frequently until they're embedded into the student's psyche and into the norms and mores, and that they're automatic for the students so that they don't have to think through these routines. They're just a part of the school's way of working, way of living, way of doing, way of learning. And the sixth big idea is closely related. That's to teach and reinforce the behaviour you want to see in the school. So it's kind of like that cliche, be the change you want to see in the world. Well, explicitly teach the behaviour that you want to see in your school. It's not just going to happen by accident. There was the school principal, Lisa Holt. She was the principal for Rosebud Secondary College, and she showed just how powerful that is. She's had incredible results implementing these strategies, these multi-tiered systems of support and whole school approach to behaviour management, where she was looking at people lining up, routines pre-class, during class, after class, moving quietly and calmly around the school in the session times. And she's noticed greater attendance, greater student satisfaction, better grades, better harmony and peace around the school. It's a better learning environment for everyone. So it's worthwhile, it's worth modelling those things, but it comes at a cost to the school, to the staff, to the time, and the initial effort is quite extraordinary. She went to great lengths to inculcate these practices into the teachers, and then the teachers into their students and the whole school. She also said the gardener, the cleaners, the admin staff, the front desk staff, all of the staff got trained in these approaches for behaviour management so that it was totally consistent from top to bottom, from inside to outside of the school. And again, pointing to things like routines, proactive behaviour management strategies, school values and ethos and expectations for behaviours in the hallways, between class, before school, after school, the whole gambit. So they did things like observational feedback models, teacher-to-teacher coaching models, and micro-teaching, where they'd film themselves and each other and give feedback. Then they'd give feedback on feedback for the teachers. So there was a really integrated and embedded support structure. And so I saw that, the sense was that if you do anything less than that, a lot of these practices aren't going to have much traction over the long run. Now, the seventh big idea is that evidence-based teaching is an ethical imperative for the disadvantaged. And I think sometimes we forget that students who are going to benefit most from evidence-based reforms in schools are those who are at the bottom end of the distribution, whether that be around attendance rates, whether that be around behaviours, whether that be around academic achievement and well-being. We know that these evidence-based reforms often have a interaction effect with those who are at the lowest end of the distribution. So that's where the ethical imperative comes from. If you really want equality and equity in the classroom, these are going to be measures that you'll want to take, because they're going to give you the best bang for your buck in terms of investing your time and seeing return on the investments of those efforts with the people, the students who need it most. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting, Stacey Rowe, who's one of the leaders for the Fogarty Foundation, which works in this space of educational disadvantage, she said that leaders must invest if they expect their staff to invest. And so that means what she's pointing out is the sacrifice that needs to be made on behalf of the leadership in schools has to be demonstrated to the rest of the staff, that there are leaders who are prepared to walk their talk and not ask others to do things that they wouldn't be prepared to do themselves. So there's an integrity element there, and I think that was really important. There was also a panel, she was part of it, so Stacey Rowe from the Fogarty Foundation, but also Matt Wright from the educational branch of Deloitte Access Economics Australia. He said that there are several themes that help improve change management projects that are designed and targeted towards improving disadvantage in schools. The three things were to place a spotlight on a hero or a champion of change in the school, so that that is made visible and known to everyone in the school. Change management protocols should be written and visible everywhere and articulated to staff with an expectation that that is going to be enacted by everyone from the top to the bottom and in between the staff and the students and the whole community around the school. And he also said a bit of luck. Some of these change management programs that aim to help students with disadvantage and provide a more equitable educational setting, sometimes they need a bit of luck. They talk about the Matthew effect, the rich get rich, the poor get poorer, and how there's a natural sort of compounding effect at either end of the distribution. And certainly I think we saw the disproportionate disadvantage applied to those people who were already disadvantaged prior to COVID, both with their learning and with the economic access opportunities that they had around accessing schooling, accessing supports and resources. So that's where bad luck and good luck come into play. And we shouldn't just leave it to luck, was the message, the final message there, that we should do whatever we can to ensure that luck doesn't determine outcomes in education. Now, the eighth big idea was, what can the science of learning offer us? And the answer, by Dr. Nathaniel Swain, who's just written a book on this, is cognitive load theory. So cognitive load theory was a theory that was founded by John Sweller, who's an academic in New South Wales, and it's all about the idea of intrinsic, extrinsic and domain cognitive load built around the principles of how we know working memory and how that interfaces with long-term memory. One of the things that I found quite interesting amongst the educational community is that if you had asked me 5-10 years ago whether I thought cognitive load theory was going to have massive uptake and almost mimetic qualities in the field of education, I would have said no way. It's just like a repackaging of the principles we knew from Baddeley and Hitch and a lot of the working memory research from long ago. But it's actually more than that. It's not just a package around that or a theoretical framework around that. There are extensions into teaching practices and the way that the working memory interfaces with the environment, and that nebulous space in between. And I think that's one of the more powerful things, is that it's an instructional framework, it's an instructional theory, and teachers find it very practical. And it goes back to my first point, where practical strategies win out over evidence-based strategies. Fortunately for John Sweller's work, it's both evidence-based strategy and it's a practical strategy. So cognitive load theory is really important. The 9th point is that not everyone is on the science of learning bandwagon. This was a point made by Greg Ashman, who's a school principal from Clarendon College in Ballarat. He said there's an entire immune system that is designed to reject the science of learning, and it means that trying to use these ideas in practice will be met with opposition and resistance. So I think that's something I've come to understand, that there are ideological differences, and the battleground of ideas in education is fierce. You have lots of things like the culture wars manifesting in education. You have the reading wars in education. You have direct explicit instruction camp and the discovery-based, problem-based learning camp, and those two are going at it now. So there are lots of schisms and fractures and factions in education, and those different worlds come together and collide, and occasionally people disagree. And that's a healthy education system where there's healthy disagreement, as long as we can disagree agreeably. And that's one of the things that I think we're still trying to navigate in the education space. Another quote that I thought was beautiful from Greg Ashman was, "Knowledge is the substance of thought. A knowledge-rich curriculum is therefore no less than a way of teaching people how to think." We often get swept up in this idea of teaching people how to think, not what to think. But I think I'm starting to challenge myself around that. In the past, I thought teaching people what to think is dogma. It's essentially an indoctrination approach to education, which I do not want to be a part of. So I always thought teaching people how to think is really what I'm about as an educator. But really, I think you teach people how to think when you couch that around and interface that with what to think. Right? Those two things are inextricably, or at least intimately interlinked. So a knowledge-rich curriculum is the only place to really start to scaffold the how to think, the critical thinking, the creative thinking. You always have to have it, couched in a context of rich curriculum, rich content. So teaching people the principles of metacognition, for example, won't make sense unless you say metacognition in relation to mathematics learning, metacognition in relation to literacy, reading, numeracy. So all of those factors need to be applied to a domain or a body of knowledge before they are maximally, or even there's a modicum of meaning in them. So if you want to have traction with teaching people how to think, consider also teaching them what to think and bringing those two together. It's a very powerful way to think about it. And the program director, Sarah Richardson, for ERO, the Australian Educational Research Organisation, said some really important points. She said this: "Just because we want more evidence-based practices in schools, it doesn't mean we get it. There are many barriers and roadblocks to implementing evidence in schools." And I think this is where the ideals we have in life and the real world that we live in are sometimes miles apart. And I think this is where you need to start to figure out, through the implementation sciences, what are the biggest, best enablers of practice and being able to translate evidence into practice. And what happens to the evidence once it goes from the laboratory to the classroom? Does it still retain the fidelity of effects that it had in the laboratory? We can't just assume that. Implementation science has taught us better than that. So she was very, I thought, careful in how she made that point, and I think it's a point that's a subtle point that's missed on a lot of people who simply like to quote evidence or the evidence as if it's some kind of doctrine preached from on high. It's not like that. Evidence is messy. It's prone to error, it's prone to bias, and it's often, you get the shiniest, best version of it when it's in a journal article. When you put it into practice, it loses a lot of that shine and it loses a lot of its potency. So implementation science is the science of how we implement evidence into practice and mobilize knowledge amongst educators. And so we've got to understand that more carefully. Hopefully at some point soon, I've got a research project that's looking at the implementation science of evidence in education. I'll be able to tell you more clearly what are some of the drivers and enablers, and proportionally what makes the biggest difference for educators in the uptake of evidence in educational contexts. Now, the 10th and final point is that student success needs teacher support. Teachers need to be successful before students can become successful in schools. How do we make teachers successful? I thought that Ross Fox mentioned something quite profound here. Again, he's in charge of Catholic Ed in Canberra, in Australia. He said that if you want a student-centered approach to teaching and learning, the most important student in a school is not the conventional student from K to 12, it is the teacher. They need to be a student of their own craft. And so we teach the teachers as we would the students about the evidence. Right, about what are the most effective pedagogies, what are the most effective behavior management strategies, what are the most effective teaching strategies and learning strategies for them to embrace, to help reach the people that they want to reach in their classrooms. So we need to support teachers in doing that, and we need to see their success as students of teaching before we start to see the success of their students as well. And that requires a great deal of support and resources. So unless we resource teachers, then we're setting them up to fail. I thought that's, like some people would say that's an obvious point, but I think it's a great point to finish on there. One of the really optimistic notes that this point was made on was that there's plenty of resources out there now, and I'm trying to create these videos as a part of that so that teachers can access the evidence more easily and interface with the discussions around evidence and how to implement that and mobilize that in the classroom. There are pre-packaged programs that are evidence-based that teachers can gain access to and schools can gain access to, so they don't have to become researchers to interface with and implement the evidence in their classrooms. So there's a lot of hope there, and I think the more that schools and jurisdictions and governments can support teachers to succeed, the more success we'll see in their students. So that summarises the 10 big ideas from my attendance at the Australian Schools Improvement Summit. I was very grateful to go and my institution. I'm so thankful to Australian Catholic University for putting me up to attend that for that couple of days. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you're an educator who had benefit from listening to this video, please do share it along to someone else who you think might benefit from this and find value in watching. Thanks for listening.